Here we are joined once again on the Nine Diamonds Watch Network with our good friend and analyst, Rupert August. How are you doing, sir?
I'm very well, as usual. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing great. Excellent to see that there was a Marxist female statue of a non-indigenous woman placed upon, well, I guess the statue was of some fella named Edward, right? And he was
Colston,
apparent
yes.
Edward Colston was he called, right? Okay, and yeah, I guess following the trend of defenestrating, I suppose they're not technically defenestrating, but any excuse
It's a
to
good word,
use
though.
any excuse to use that verb, okay? Chucking statues off of plinths and, cultural warfare via statues. Following that trend, they pulled this statue down in town of Edward Colston. And, anybody of a native European descent during that week or two that there was going on with the peak of the Black Lives Matter and Seattle autonomous zones popping up and all sorts of PSYOP and MK Ultra results coming out from the United States infecting the UK. And yes, they placed an artist, right? I believe she's from London, or at least she's a London-based artist. She could be from the USA for all we know, right? She placed this African woman statue with the raised fist, like Black Panther style, basically, on the plinth, and whoever paid for all of this stunt to be done, there was people taking photos and victorious things and whatever. But doesn't matter, because the local council in Bristol, good old Bristol, Pirate Port, that's where the pirate accent comes from. Or they're also right next to Somerset, right? Those guys have both got like a hilariously similar accent. But if I've got that wrong, I'm going to be very embarrassed, and someone's going to have to revoke my Anglo card. But yes, they pulled it down 5:30 the next day, and the local mayor, I believe, or the local councillors gave the statement saying it is up to the people of Bristol to decide what replaces that statue. So they weren't very impressed with that, but it caused the usual social media scene. But a little bit of a white pill that is rare to come by in Old Albion sometimes, to see that the local council straight away went, no, I'm taking that down, that's ridiculous. And they put it in a skip, and I believe right now it will be sitting in the waste and recycling section of the local Skipton. It's not Skipton skip, Bristolian skip. So a good white pill there. After the white pill, I'd just like to highlight something that's been going on in London for a while, and Rupert, you can stop me where I think I might have got this right or wrong, but my interpretation of the two graphs on screen now, for those of you just listening in audio, we have a map of London up, and in the centre of London we can see a lot of blue marks, blue areas, which show white British self-described people raising in occupancy of the centre. The more expensive parts of London are more white British, whereas, your Enfields, your Brent, your Barking and Dagenham, Redbridge, all of these areas, what's another fit? East London, North London, West London areas that are famous for having, shall we say, very ethnically diverse, but traditionally British working class natives as well. Not so much these days, in decline in ways of up to 40 to 50% in some areas. And this consolidation of wealthier elites, I imagine they are, in areas such as Richmond, Camden, Islington, even Hackney. But obviously, East Hackney's still a shithole, as it always has been. Ask Diane Abbott. So, what do you think about this? Do you think it's... because a long time there's been a talking point floating around in MSM and alternative media, where they've been talking about white flight and kind of celebrating, wow, London's below 50% ethnic British. But if you look at where the population has gone, the rest of the country outside of the very big urban city centres like perhaps Manchester, Leeds, Newcastle, and so forth. Outside of those areas, it looks like Britons have just returned to monkey. Returned to the farmlands, returned to the rural areas.
More or less, yes. Though it's currently mostly to provincial towns. A point on the London situation, though, specifically. So it's probably the situation is probably going to be slightly different for other towns, for other cities rather. But particularly for London, I think at this point the statistics on who's actually living there, the percentages of people who are living there, who self-identify as white British, is going to be pretty much bunk in terms of the actual quality of the statistics, because they'll imply something which I no longer think is the case, which is that at this point, most of the people who are living there, most of the natives who are living there, I would say, are doing so for work reasons and don't intend to stay there into the long term. It is not a place that, in my experience, anybody really enjoys living anymore, unless you happen to be, one of these people who's managed to find their way in a council house, on some good level of benefits or whatever that means that you can be entrenched there and not have to worry about working opportunities and not having enough of a wage, or the people who earn so much that it doesn't matter.
Yes.
I think those are the two people who are going to be
underclass or overclass, right?
Yeah. But that means that the percentage of white Britons that are actually living in London is going to be, changing from year to year quite drastically, I suspect, because people want to get out of there as quickly as possible, in my experience.
Yeah, that totally matches up with the information that I have from no, it's a year and 2 months ago that I last visited Britain. Wow, it was a shithole in London, yeah, for real. But there definitely is money moving around, and it does have some very fun and vibrant areas, but it's also Stab City, right? So fuck it.
Yeah.
Run to the country, return to small countryside living. I'm sure that's what we're really adapted for in Britain anyway. But today, Rupert, we are going to be taking a look around the globe, taking a look at geopolitical developments. I think you could take us away with your expert eye on Europe. How about it?
Well, just before that, I'd like to put one more addendum on that point of Britain's reverting to the sort of provincial towns and such, which is that the problem is that a lot of the time the ideas don't change. And this is something that people have been pointing out in the exodus from California to Texas as well, is that although all those people are leaving, which is a certain, admonition, is that the right word? That's a certain rejection of the consequences of their ideas.
Is it admonishment? Admonishment.
I hope that's the right word.
Who knows?
Anyway.
I don't speak English.
That despite the fact that they have, abandoned the consequences of their ideas, i.e., creating a multi-culti shithole, they don't abandon their ideas so easily. So, in all likelihood, a lot of these people are going to be bringing the same ideas that cast them out of the cities to the provincial towns, and thus ruining them in that sense.
Yeah.
Not to mention, of course, concreting over large parts of the British countryside, which is something that Morgoth has definitely done some content on, and the tragedy of his particular neck of the woods.
Thank you for the reminder. Morgoth is a great creator, and I haven't seen his stuff in ages. I just can't. Well, I keep my eyes elsewhere for these quick rundowns of yours, but it's interesting to hear that this might not be. Well, yeah. I mean, if there's anything that's well entrenched, it's these ideas that you speak of, these cosmopolitan, very quote-unquote not really well experienced, quite well travelled, but maybe lived as went everywhere they went as a tourist and never really saw anything outside of touristified areas, or have a very romantic view of how foreign life is, right? But fail to see that the very system that they subscribe to is that which ooh. That is the one that describes the rotting fat at the edge of the belly of the whale. But looking elsewhere to Europe, how are we looking to fry this dead old carcass up?
Well, on the in keeping with that same theme, I think it'd be interesting to talk about France because we've talked a lot about Zion in the past. Peter Zion.
Yeah, Peter
Uh,
Zihan, yeah.
right, yeah, Zion, and he touts France as one of the big winners in the coming years. Partially, I think, because they've managed to do a better job of solving the demographic crisis that many other countries, particularly in Asia, are about to suffer. Problem is that they've not done this through birth rates. They've done it through immigration and importing other people's, and to some extent using their birth rates to prop up their own vastly substandard ones. And so what that's created is obviously large parts of France which are no longer French by an ethnic metric. They don't even track that stuff, which makes it even more problematic. They tend to have an extreme aversion to tracking ethnic and religious data, as I recall.
Yes,
Definitely
like
ethnic,
Sweden. Sweden excludes a lot of it in the case of them not being native Swedish. So yes, you have that same neoliberal selective racial blindness towards the, well, try and unpack that one. It's a whole podcast in itself. But yes, so France is looking to be a winner in Europe in future forecasts because they've imported a shitload of immigrants from, basically anywhere outside of France, but specifically ex-colonial territories, I imagine. Like ex-French territories?
Quite often, yes. So they had a major influx from Algeria, thanks to the Algerian crisis and all the fallout from that, because what ended up happening is that there was a whole lot of pro-French Algerians that couldn't be left with there was a specific name for them. I can't remember what it was. They couldn't be left with the new Algerian regime. For fairly obvious reasons. There would have been reprisals and all of that against them, against anybody who was suspected of being a sympathizer. And so instead of, basically they brought them all back to France rather than doing anything a little bit more ethnically of an ethnic consideration, you might say.
Just choosing their indigenous population over just importing tax cattle and worker units.
Yeah, well, I mean, in that case, I think it's more political than it is economic. But
importing voters, even worse. Yeah.
Well, yeah, or that they consider themselves to have some kind of obligation to the people who they imported. If they fought on behalf of France during the Algerian crisis or any number of other things like that. But be that as it may, it's turned into a very economic phenomenon because there are. The different thing about France is that they have a problem with more natives being sucked into the urban environments. For some reason, France became a very urban country in terms of its mindset and how it thought of itself and where all the money was and all that kind of thing. And so the cities, even more so than other countries, suck in all of the people, which leaves desolate provincial areas and rural towns and such. And so you have the bizarre phenomenon in parts of southern France, particularly of old medieval style French villages, which are populated entirely by people in burqas and niqabs and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, wearing bin bags. I believe they. Can we say that?
We'll find out.
Yes. Oh, letterbox. I think Boris Johnson, he's a prime minister, right? He said something about bin bags and letterboxes before. So, take it up with him. All right? Go and see him. He's got COVID and he's got over it now. So, let him know. Bin bags, letterboxes. Do you remember that, Bozza? But is there anything else on France or elsewhere in Europe?
Well, so I bring all of this up because it's relevant to some recent events where they've had ethnic clashes between two of these immigrant groups, which is quite interesting and potentially a portent of things to come. I mean, they've had a couple of things actually. So they also had a set of protests verging on riots by illegal immigrants, basically, who were demanding citizenship, by force, by trying to occupy. I believe it was the Pantheon in Paris.
Oh wow! Okay, fuck.
Yeah, and demanding to be given, citizenship and any number of other benefits that were probably in the demands. It's rarely something just so rights based. or so legal. There's usually something a bit more tangibly financial to the equation. But
Oh, right. Okay. Straight to the fucking point. I see.
And then in the other case, it was in Dijon, over in Brittany, so a little bit southeast of Paris, and basically, I won't go into the details, but effectively there was an enormous group of Chechens and Algerians who were fighting each other in the streets, armed with knives, guns, even using cars as weapons, and fighting a ranging street battle until the police were able to come and simmer things down a little bit. But considering this is on the background of all of the existing protests and such that have always been going on, or have been continually going on, we're kind of seeing almost like the different nodes of social instability that are just kind of creeping in on Macron. And I wonder if there's a point at which Macron is going to have to effectively choose a side and say, these are the people that I'm willing to ally with and give political favor to, in terms of some kind of street present faction, in order to stave off the rest, which was very much a phenomenon of the 1920s and 30s. When when social instability got very bad, then there were decisions made as to who would be favored, because that would allow them to actually get on top of the problem. The police, as it stands, were not sufficient. I don't know if we'll be returning to that situation, but it kind of seems like it from the amount of different sets of protests and such that are erupting in France. They just don't. I don't think they have the manpower to deal with it unless they would bring in the army or something, and that's an untenable situation in itself.
Hey, the thing about Dijon and its Chechens and who was it? Turks? Sorry, not Chechens and Turks.
No, it was Chechens and not Turks and Algerians. Yeah.
Yes, that was it. Yeah, I remember. We shared the footage in our network, didn't we, of the car attack that they used. Oh man, that was a crazy one. That was like a Volkswagen. No, it wasn't a Volkswagen. It was a Renault or Peugeot or something, some kind of French car, right? And he flipping barrel rolled it into that guy. It was a pretty crazy footage. They also had the typical shooting in the air of stuff, and as someone who, I'm no regular big iron toting cowboy, but watching complete noobs handle these on what I can assume are mismatched shotguns and single shot modified flare gun pistols and stuff, but then also some pretty formidable hardware is in Beretta 9mm and stuff coming up to more modern Glocks and stuff that I was seeing in these videos, armed. It was real mismatched stuff, like some gangster had got this in, and that's very often how smuggled guns look in the UK and rest of Britain and stuff. It's really mismatched stuff, and it's hard to find ammunition for anything that isn't that very common, like 9mm pistol or shotgun, 12 gauge or something like this, right? But they had enough ammunition to be shooting in the air, running around and, posing for TikTok and whatnot. It was a crazy mess. And just like you say, whilst this is going on, you have not only the Black Lives Matter and the general French anti-state protests that go on with a massive faction of not only leftists but just annoyed rural peoples as well. Have you seen? Oh yeah, that's a nice tangent. Have you seen what's going on in the Netherlands, in Holland, with the tractor protests? Not so exciting that they're charging them into people like Chechens are, but they're protesting outside Belgium and blocking roads with tractors. I thought it was very Dutch.
No, actually, tell me more about that.
It's not particularly interesting, but they're levying a climate tax against the people that they perceive as being the most polluting, right? And the agricultural industry in Holland is one of their biggest contributors. But if you take like what they do, their carbon emission, which I don't think is a great way to measure how much damage someone is doing to the planet. We are humans. We are going to need to spend some of these resources or expend parts of land in order to feed this massive 7 billion population. Not only not only to mention that once you get rid of things like agrarian industry and stuff like that, you destroy part of the human experience, human culture, history that has led up to this moment. In all of these countries, I mean, it's mostly factory farming now, just as it is, but to to take one of your highly productive industries, right, and levy a climate tax against them, in order to get back against the politicians, they have driven their tractors, I believe, into Belgium. I believe it's an EU headquarters. I could have this wrong. They could have driven it to the capital of, is it Rotterdam? Or I'm afraid I've forgotten.
Amsterdam is the capital
Is it?
of the Netherlands. But
Oh,
yeah,
right.
I believe so. Anyway, but no, there is an EU HQ in Brussels. So yeah, I could believe that. That would make sense.
Yeah, it was a climate thing, and it ended up being a piece of legislation that the agriculture industry would end up having to pay a massive tax. And I'm not being funny, but those who run agriculture in Europe, right? They are quite wealthy generally, but they are not like a high class aristocratic elite in my experience. What would you say about that, Rupert?
Um, I think it quite depends. So you have the provincial. That's going to be my word of the day, I guess. You have the provincial farmer type, who has a fairly small plot of land. At this point they're probably quite industrialized, and they're certainly not, some kind of aristocrat. In fact, a lot of the time they're working on rented land, and so
Yes,
what you
that was
see
my
is
understanding too. Yeah, they don't own the land, but they work it. Yeah.
yeah. So the people who actually own the land, which sometimes is still people who are countryside based and have something of a farmer mindset. But those are the people who you see in a UK context. This is speaking. Those are the people who you'll see driving around Range Rovers, wearing tweed and flat caps and wellies and things. They
Yeah,
don't
and they're
actually
like
work the land, they own it.
yes, they're more. Yeah, that's right. They're landowners, old school landowners. But those people will generally be better off, or at the very least middle class. But they're not like high class elites who should be having like these climate taxes levied at them. It just the focus of what Europe, to me, and I'm sure to many listening and to yourself, you would agree with this in for different reasons and similar reasons, but the things that are spent, they spend Parliament and Senate time on, it's just farcical. When you think of the contributions in history and today of carbon emissions from Europe, it is minuscule, tiny, tiny stuff that contributes to the overall, not only carbon value, but, how much damage we do to the planet. We don't like to sit and live in waste material, barren landscapes, We take care of what little we have left just in the general mindset, right? So this disconnection and focus on trivial or not even provable, but definitely popular themes, it just boggles the mind to think that you can have such destructive and degenerative technology at the hands of children and bad actors, and yet the interests of Parliament are climate taxes and destroying what little productive industries and culture, not only culture bringing, but just nice. It's nice to have an agrarian population in some part of the country, or a beautiful fields of flowers and Dutch windmills and whatever, or rolling hills full of sheep if you bring it back to my homeland. But what about the rest of, did we skip anything important with France other than the fact that they should have the guillotine outside ready for Macron when he can't handle it? He might slip and fall in the shower. There's always that.
There is a bit to talk about in terms of France's foreign policy, because that's one thing that I think they've done quite well on traditionally. They almost immediately established a kind of neo-colonial empire in a way that Britain didn't opt to do. So instead of, So this is a little bit before the main phenomenon, but it illustrates the point very nicely. Is that if you're familiar with the story of the Haitian Revolution, Haiti used to be a colony of France. It was one of the most profitable colonies over in the Caribbean, growing sugar and such. But there was a long line of events that culminated in a slave revolt, essentially, that overthrew the colonial government, and they opted not to continue the war to reconquer it. So instead of letting that go, France instead decided to effectively colonize the island via financial means instead. So they bought up most of the relevant financial assets, loaned the government a whole lot of money, and effectively got to restructure, demand the terms of the restructuring of the Haitian economy via financial means instead of, military and overt ownership. And that's been a situation that's basically continued ever since. They did much the same with the rest of their particularly West African holdings. And so decolonization, apart from in the case of Indochina and Algeria, was pretty much a surface level thing where they maintained a lot of the soft mechanisms of power, right down to even having West African currency printed in France and effectively controlled from France.
That is very interesting.
And so
I was not even aware of this sort of connection over with France having over its former colonies, because just as you say, the British haven't retained that stuff at all, really.
They basically handed over most of the colonies in terms of the soft power in them over to America, which France, being relatively anti-American since the de Gaulle years, has not been quite so willing to do that kind of thing, and they've maintained a robust foreign policy and the capability of robust foreign policy for themselves a lot better than most of the other European countries have. And so they're definitely going to want to keep an eye on going forward in terms of what their positioning is in different parts of, well, the world, really. And this is especially relevant, and it segues well into what's been going on in Turkey and Libya, because France is one of the countries that was posturing against Turkey's attempts to set up what seems to be effectively a satellite state in Libya on the basis of the civil war that's going on. It's boiled down to two main factions now in Libya: the GNA, which is the Government of National Accord, and the LNA, which is the Libyan National Army, I believe.
GNA are Islamist, are they not?
I think so. At this point, I'm far more familiar with what their alignments are internationally than what their actual supposed positions are on the ground.
Yes, and that's a very good way to put it too, because whatever ideology this faction was psyoped away from, right? Here's where the funding went to. Here's where the loyalty was pinned to. Yes, that's right. So
basically.
So France, what were they doing to counterbalance this? Have they backed off now? Because I remember there being something about it in the headlines, but it's totally been memory hold for me.
Well, okay, funny story. France sent a few gunboats to conduct, some gunboat diplomacy over to the arms shipments that were taking place between Turkey and Western Libya, which is where the GNA strongholds are. So Turkey have been supplying arms to the GNA for a little while now, and by some reports, mercenaries and such as well. Actual units on the ground.
Standard.
France tried to intercept this, demanding that they stand down, and they were completely ignored by Turkey. Funnily enough, about a week later, some major Turkish military hardware gets hit by some French hardware. It's top of the line stuff. Jets and brand new missiles and such that found their way into the hands of the LNA, which were actually beyond the capability of the. So this is anti-air platforms being destroyed at something like 3 or 4 times their maximum range, because the French equipment is just so much better than what Turkey has access to and can supply. And there's also reports that the targeting equipment itself, even if it had theoretically been possible to shoot down the jet that was delivering the package, the asset, it was jammed. So nobody's saying it, but reading between the lines, it seems that Turkey was kind of, suffering a bit of French reprisal.
Yes, it seems. Well, so France has used their own proxy against them to kind of counterbalance this. Is that what you would say?
Yes, well, upping the support for this proxy. Um,
Yeah, giving them
but
fancier hardware. Do you think that
yeah,
was
yeah, exactly.
possibly so? France are aligned with GNA,
France are aligned with the LNA.
right? Okay. So, all right, okay. So I wonder if the drone tech. There was a photo shared earlier in the network, well, much earlier, I'd say, at least over a month now, of it was labeled as a GNA fighter, but you never know which one it is or if this is footage from here or there or who knows where, right? But he had some kind of Spartan laser looking thing, which is a weapon from Halo if you've ever played that. But he had some kind of like anti drone, very sci fi looking piece of tech. And I was going to say that guy looked like the most sci fi movie, well armed jihadi that I've ever seen. It was bizarre to see some of the stuff that they were coming out with loot. Not only like whole tanks and shitloads of Soviet mortars and stuff that's just like legacy equipment laid over, but modern H&K arms. I'm like, this is expensive hardware. It's not what you usually see militant groups fighting with. But I suppose this kind of equipment, the prices for this kind of stuff when you're selling oil by the barrel, you've got ISIS oil barrels going out to Turkey and all sorts of different slave market things going on in Libya. I suppose you've got money for a bit better than World War II and Soviet era technology these days.
Oh yeah, so it's bizarre seeing some of the equipment that the LNA now has because they've got support from a whole bunch of different countries, including most recently Egypt. Egypt has been significantly upping their support, and so it isn't looking unlikely that sometime in the next month, if not less, if this escalates any further, then we're going to see a full-on Egyptian intervention. They have troops at the border, and they are waiting to be given the green light, and Egypt's laid out their red lines for what they would consider sufficient to go and intervene on behalf of the LNA. I should say they support the LNA.
Yes, I've seen that tribal leaders in Libya have kind of come together to say that they want to legally give permission to the Egyptian army to enter. Is that right?
Yes. Yep. That's the last update that I've seen on the matter. But I was going to say that it's bizarre seeing the equipment that the LNA has because, well, I mean, at this point they're better armed than some NATO countries.
Yes, because of defunding and neoliberalism. Yes, unfortunately, it's
In
crazy.
combination with the sheer amount of equipment that's been pumped into the LNA.
Oh, I can't wait
It's
for this. Are they
fascinating.
going to stream it? I hope it'll be like Donbass, where every fighting zone has a streamer on YouTube or Live Leak dedicated to it. Maybe they can branch out to TikTok and what's the other one I'm thinking? I'm thinking of D Live, of course.
You probably have to be on Arabic Twitter or something for that.
Ambar Shalina Sararim. Yes, we'll get the dank nasheeds will be played.
But okay, so let's follow this line back to Turkey then, because Turkey's been making a lot of moves recently with the Libyan situation being only one. Of course, they've been ebbing very recently, but upping the pressure overall over the long term with Syria, and gradually encroaching more and more on the northern territories that they are in close proximity to. This is obviously going to be prolonging the war because that civil war definitely would have ended by now over in Syria if it had not been for the Turkish involvement. The rebel groups are basically on their last legs. If I'm not even sure what territory they still own, so it would be down to just the pro-Assad forces and the Kurds, were it not for Turkey getting involved in such a big way and supporting all of the militia groups that they've been supporting, and of course, also just like I said, occupying territory outright. They've been trying to increase the pressure there as well, and gradually moving in on more and more territory, setting out more and more sort of caveats, or I suppose, or red lines that would cause them to claim justification, let's say, for encroaching further. But at this point, I'm not entirely sure what the end game is there. Whether it would be to. So I can't imagine that it would be acceptable by any stretch for them to just decide that they're going to annex the territories that they currently do. And it's a bit of a long shot to claim that any of the militias that they're supporting, regardless of how well armed they are going to be able to displace the Assad regime at this point. I think the support
Yes.
from Russia is too strong. So,
Russia really when Russia stepped in, it just became a game of, does the USA really wish to, well, to invoke any wrath from Russia, or does Russia really want to, well, just having those troops there negates a lot of action, because these two large powers, well, in the case of the USA, they like beating up crippled kids in terms of their foreign policy, right? Which is a pretty nasty, I suppose. Oh, I'm so mean to the US war machine. How will they cope? But, their targets, come on, Vietnam. Who else we got? All of these Middle
Iraq.
Eastern countries. Yeah, Iraq, Afghanistan, and what? You're the world's premier economy with the biggest illegal Israeli-built tech that you're supposed to have, and oh yeah, you've got media corps on the bottom faking gas attacks and whatnot, and oh god, you just run in there and blow up this Osama bin Laden caricature every single time. It's like, as I say, it's like beating up a crippled person. It's just disgusting. So by Russia calling them out, it was just, wow, that is a really simple and easy fix that just stops that rubbish happening. And yeah, I suppose it was all made evident when they just took the Crimea and nobody did anything. Because what can you do, really? What can you do?
It's still considered an open issue, and I believe the war in the Donbass is still ongoing as well. It's just perhaps got simmered down to a very low ebb, if not complete ceasefire. But technically still
it might
ongoing.
be like militia stuff, yeah.
Yeah, basically. But of course, the issue there is that it's a fascinating look into, I guess, the downfall of an empire, because at this point it's quite clear that there aren't any major threats on the international stage that are going to be able to properly contend with US military might. So it becomes a question of, how do you demoralize it to such an extent that the US doesn't actually want to use it anymore? And I think we're seeing the fruition of that. I mean, put in different terms, that's what Peter Zeihan was talking about as well, with regards to America deciding that it doesn't want to be involved quite so heavily with the affairs of the rest of the world.
Yeah, they don't want to be world police anymore. And Trump's whole, well, do you know what the Q boomer, the QAnon believer take is on this? That they brought Obama in to start weakening the US, and then Hillary was supposed to totally retract from the world stage. But we've seen this happen with Trump anyway, right? So he's been more isolationist than ever. And even Bill Gates, famous vaccine RFID chip in your left buttocks, Bill Gates.
Aficionado.
Yeah. You know, old Bill, he's good at probing anuses. Oh, Bill, put that probe down. Yeah, he even remarked that, I can't believe the US is taking a backseat at such a prominent time. And actually, do you know what? He's right. Because it is a crazy time to very suddenly just go, you know what? I'm going to lay off the gas. Kind of makes you think that there's something going on behind the presidency. And perhaps the president, even though he was chanting, build the wall, couldn't even get his, what you would call, his major campaign promise to manifest, despite being the world's #1 economy. But I repeat myself, it's almost as if there's a shadow elite working behind the scenes.
So perhaps that's one explanation, but I don't feel the need to go to that kind of explanation, because it's something that we see so often in history, particularly when you're talking about Republican entities which have a tendency towards factionalization. It means that you've almost automatically got roughly 50% of the population who are going to be in opposition to whatever you try and do, and therefore especially in the case of a war, which is such a high profile and eminently criticizable, even in the case of success situation. So you're still going to take casualties, and so you can still make the argument from an oppositional perspective. Were those casualties really worth it for what you got? And that's it's not. It's meant to be a rhetorical point more than anything.
Yes,
because it's,
you
it's,
can
it's
constantly.
It's very subjective.
You can constantly neg any kind of war effort. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. And so what that means is that you're constantly going to be working under a situation of ever more demoralization, and the unwillingness to even use those military assets that you've spent so much time cultivating. I think that has a wear and tear effect over the long term for the ability of any leadership to properly deploy those kinds of resources and prop itself up.
I see. Well, that's been quite the runaround, and we didn't get to Asia, but we are coming in at the good old sacred 4-0. So I think we should wrap it up here, but definitely we will be back for another data-dense Geopol in maybe a week or two. We'll see what happens. We'll treat you guys to an extra special edition of Abyssal Staring into the data streams. Any parting words, Rupert, before we sign off here, my friend?
Yeah, we didn't even finish Europe. There was other things to get to. So we got as far west, or as far east rather, as the Netherlands. There's some things going on in Germany that are quite interesting, because apart from anything else, they, as I understand it, this is not such a recorded phenomenon in the news, but more something that I've heard from people more personally, that they have a similar thing going on with people returning to a provincial kind of lifestyle. It never quite escapes them to the same extent, but more than that you're not seeing the same level of, I guess, USification or Americanification.
And that
of,
sorry, just to interrupt. That is an excellent way to put what is going on in Europe. It is they are trying to create the same explosive and divided population that is captivated by these ideas of democracy and this system and this capitalist-driven nonsense, basically. But yes, the USification, the factionalization of this sort of stuff, and the demoralization of specifically the European white population, shall we say. But yeah, that's what the EU, whether it intends it or not, and I do think it is something that is intentionally driven personally. But the USification, the United States, the European Union, come on. Which Ministry of Peace do you want to sign up for? A more Republican system or a parliamentary system? Take your pick.
Well, it's more granular than that, because what I was referring to specifically was the delocalization of a lot of populations. So you have people moving around for work all over the place, and thus they don't have anywhere near as much of a close tie to where they were born and brought up. Because particularly in the case of Germany, compared to even some other European nations, is they have a very localized culture with some pretty significant regional differences. Particularly if you're talking about something like Schleswig-Holstein, I believe it's still called, and wait, no, that was given back. What am I talking about? No, the area up near it might just be Holstein, the bit in the far north, the bit on the Jutland Danish peninsula, but the German bit of that, versus Bavaria. Those are two very different cultures, and I think you see that more prominently. And so what Germany is doing is they are preserving those
regionalizations. Yeah, like a regionalized thing. Yeah, because so what you're saying is like in the US, where they just I'll move to California, I'll move to New York, I'll move to Houston, I'll move to one of these big cities for a job, and I'll just end up here. And if I can make it there, I can make it anywhere. It's not really much of a not homeland, but homestead, home state, homestead, I guess you could say it is. But it's with that attitude that we talked about at the beginning with London. People show up there because they begrudgingly want to work there to make money, and that's where the money is in Britain. That's where the seat of power is in London, right? So if you go there, you're disconnected from your home and such like this. But yeah, I see what you mean. That's what you were saying by the USification kind of thing, yes?
Yeah, but there is more to it. I mean, everything else that you pointed out is correct. It's
just a different way to look at it. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. It's another aspect of the same phenomenon. But so yeah, they've been trying to preserve that, but also they've been, as I understand it, trying to set up a pipeline to, of all places, Russia.
Yeah, I heard about this. Isn't this a gas pipeline?
Yes, yes.
They've been talking
So
about this for bloody years, and the US hates it because the US supplies them gas, or they just don't want. I can't remember why the USA took big issue with it, but I remember Britain and the USA were pushing not not to allow Germany and Russia to have this pipeline between each other.
I imagine it's more for geopolitical considerations because it provides a constant stream of revenue for Russia, and it also ties Germany's fortunes a bit more to Russia's, and so obviously then they're going to be more natural allies going forward.
Yes,
which,
of course.
I mean, if that influence ends up trickling down into Central Europe from Russia, that kind of cultural influence and the political influence, then I think we might see a more healthy Germany.
I agree.
Which would be nice.
Yeah, I mean, you look at. Obviously, they've not started with a very good hand. If we go with Putin era Russia, if you go from his starting point to where it is now, come on, they're one of the guys that are doing all right. They've got problems. Everybody's got tech problems, societal decadence, capitalism problems, financial debt, blah, 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 birth rates, all of this stuff, yes?
But the important thing that Russia is one of the few places that's trying to remedy it.
Precisely the point I was going to make, yeah? They still push to advance themselves, and that alone, in a race where many people can't even stand up to run, even if you're walking, you're going to win the race, long run, it's a question of will in many instances, and yeah, it seems like Russia's doing well for itself, and yeah, Putin, I always think he's a very shrewd and competent fella. He's interesting to watch the plays that come out of Russia. I mean, specifically with what we mentioned earlier about Syria. I mean, they just totally negged the USA from taking that role, and props to Assad as well. I mean, what a fucking that's a tough situation to pull off, and he's still in power today, so that's more than most world leaders can say.
The fact that it doesn't seem to have broken him either is quite a strong what would be the word? It'd be a strong indicator of a very robust personality that he must have to have been able to see that situation through and come out on the other side not crazy, basically. It seems, anyway, from what I've seen.
Yeah, there's some really cringe but absolutely hilarious Syrian nationalist anti-jihadi. Well, they're not anti-Islam, they're anti-jihadi, right? Propaganda videos that you can inshallah Assad. You got some really funny nationalist rap coming out about supporting Assad from Syria. Go and check that out. I'm sure they've got a Spotify account out there somewhere.
So yeah, I think that's my very long closing statement. Obviously, there's a lot more to talk about, so we'll have to come back to Europe soon.
Yes, definitely. Always a pleasure. Very data dense. We pack it in, and it's good to hang on to hear what's going on in Germany, especially about that bloody pipeline. I've been hearing about that for years. Thank you very much. Go and check Rupert's stuff out at rupertaugustworks.com. Thank you for joining us, and I'll see you again soon.
Goodbye.